Now we won't say anything.
I know, because it'll be used against us.
We promise it will not be used against you, for sure. Might be used for you, but it won't be used against you. So we'll wait just another minute or two to see if we
Welcome
can
back,
get
Dwayne.
everybody on as we start.
Yeah.
Welcome in.
Ours must be the smaller of the group, because I was looking and there were like, what, 36 or so people. We've only got 13 so far, so.
Well, yeah. Not necessarily the easiest topic.
So he said that it's been around a while, though. Is that right?
We started doing the eco grief circles, which we'll talk a little bit. You'll be getting kind of a mini taste of those today. And we started the first ones last summer. We've done a couple rounds and we're kind of in the middle of the third round of those. So yeah, they've been going for a little while. So you'll get a little preview of those.
Okay, I'll look forward to finding out about them.
Good, thank you. Marjorie, you're spotlighted.
I know, I have the sun in my face and I don't know what to do. Well, I think I'm gonna stop the video, at least for now.
Okay. Well, I think we'll just go ahead and start. And if other people join, that's great. And otherwise we'll just be a couple of small groups for the small groups, I think. So welcome everybody. So glad that you're here with us and decided to do this. We're grateful to be able to kind of provide and offer you a space to look a little bit at the topic of grief around climate and the other global issues that are up, because there's a lot to be feeling grief about at this point. I'm going to start with a quote from Francis Weller, who wrote a really good book about grief called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. And here's the quote. "The work of the mature person is to hold grief in one hand and gratitude in the other, and to be stretched large by them. How much sorrow can I hold? That's how much gratitude I can give. If I carry only grief, I'll bend toward cynicism and despair. If I have only gratitude, I'll become saccharine and won't develop much compassion for other people's suffering. Grief keeps the heart fluid and soft, which helps make compassion possible." So that's kind of going to be our theme and container for today. And we'll do a little ritual with that. And we'll also be talking about some of the specific emotions that we deal with in the eco grief circles that are part of the grief process. So I will name two. Sarah is our tech person for today. And she's got her phone number and name in the chat. So if you get kicked off or you're having a tech problem, you can text her and ask for help. We do ask that you keep yourself on mute other than when we're in the small groups, just so we don't have a lot of background noise. And we are recording, just so you know. So if you do speak into the larger circle, and we hope to have time for a closing ritual where you might do that, just know that's being recorded. The small groups will not be recorded. Okay, so there are 6 of us here actually today who are working with the ongoing eco grief circles, which are 7-week circles where we focus each week on a particular emotion. And we have small groups that stay consistent over those to really create some safety for people to go into the grieving process. So you're just going to get today a little mini experience of those, including a small group with one or more of us in with you. So we're going to introduce ourselves now so you get a little sense of who we are before I talk more about the grieving process. And my name is Connie Burns. I'm a psychotherapist who does body-centered work, and I live and work in Black Mountain. So Carrie, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Carrie Johnson. I'm a trained chaplain and spiritual care provider, and I live just outside of Asheville in Fairview.
Hi, I am Laura Collins. I am the interim minister at Jubilee Community in downtown Asheville, and I live in West Asheville.
Hi, everybody. I'm Martha Frame. I live in Asheville. I am a social worker. I work with people through telepsychiatry across several states, and I am in my second year of divinity studies to become a chaplain.
I can go. Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Ogletree. I am the program coordinator at North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light, which is the climate and environmental justice program of the North Carolina Council of Churches. I live in Bakersville, North Carolina, about an hour northwest of Asheville, and it's good to be with you all.
My name is Jan Faree, and I'm a coach and interior design consultant, and my focus is helping people create inner and outer sacred space. And I live in Asheville, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
So we're so glad you're all here with us. And I invite you now to just kind of take a breath. We're going to start talking about grief. And that's not such an easy topic. So I do a lot of work with grief. I'm listening to grief and loss every day as a therapist. And I came into this eco grief work because personally I got aware that it was really hard to continue to stay present to taking in information about the climate crisis, trying to make decisions about where do I put my energy in this, trying to keep my heart open and stay in a place of gratitude for being alive on this amazing planet with all the grief. And just the recognition of, wow, I need to be regularly in places where I can express the emotions that go with this in order to keep my heart fluid. And we're going to talk more about those emotions. But the reason we're doing this is that I think the more deeply you love this planet and the life on it, the more difficult it can be to stay open and to keep your body present and fluid so that you can be clear about what actions you're called to take and what you want to do, and so that you can balance that grief with gratitude and joy for the gift of being here. I also want to name that climate grief is a particularly existential process. It's ongoing. It's not like so many of the losses that, we may have read things about or been through before. When you lose a relationship or a job, or you move, or someone you love dies, there's a huge amount of grief and loss in that. But when the loss is over, you feel your feelings and you begin to adjust to what it means in your life now. And even while that grief process may continue and you may continue to shift in your relationship toward that loss, you aren't continuing to have that loss happen over and over and over in the same way that we do with the climate crisis. Like every week I'm aware that I'll see something or I'll read something, I'll experience something that brings me a new piece of grief about this. And I imagine that that's going to continue probably for the rest of my life. And so I can't get to the place where I say, whew, okay, well, now I can just figure out how to deal with my life as it is now at this place of what I've lost and what I have. We're going to continue to experience losses. And so the need for ongoing support in this grief is really, really crucial. Again, just to be able to keep ourselves open and keep our hearts awake to both sides of this, to the gratitude as well as the grief. So I want to just name having the clarity to make decisions about what you take on and what you're called to take on. I think we're all called to face into this or to act on this in our own unique ways. And I know for me, if I'm not present in my body, if it's my head that's trying to decide what is it I'm supposed to do, I can get so anxious because my head can change stories in a second and say, but you should be doing this, but this is more important, but you aren't doing that. And it's when I can settle into my body and listen to my body that my heart will say, here's where I need to go. Here's where I'm called. And it's the grieving that helps me be able to come back into my body, to empty out what needs to be emptied and be present in my body again. Okay, so what do we need to do this ongoing grief? And developing resilience is such a huge part of that. And it is, as Francis Weller said, finding that balance of gratitude and grief. So we're in need of spaces where not only we have time and space to do that, but where we have support and where we're mirrored as valid in those feelings. Usually, if we can let ourselves feel our feelings, we may have a wave that feels really big and overwhelming. I know I've gone through some of those in the last year that were pretty intense. But if we have enough safety, we come through that wave. And at the end of that wave, we might be tired. We might feel emptied out. We might feel something completely different. Sometimes we feel joy. But what we don't feel is stuck, which is where we often get to with depression when we aren't able to grieve. It's like it starts getting stored up in our bodies and blocked in. And then it's hard to move fluidly through all the responses we have to the world and the people around us. So, having the container, whether that includes ritual, conversation, deep expression, all of that can be helpful. And all of those are things that we try and offer in the Eco Grief circles. Those are really helpful at allowing us to continue to be fluid and show up. We soften the ground of our hearts and our bodies with our tears. If we don't express them, the stress begins to store up and we can get really stiff and brittle, emotionally and physically. Our bodies are affected by unexpressed emotions. My experience is that blockage also really cuts me off from connection to other people, even the people I love the most, and from connection to the natural world, which feeds me so deeply, and connection to the divine. So there's a lot of reasons why it's important to lean into the grief, as hard as that is. I want to just name too that we are living in a culture that has a really difficult relationship with grief because of many of the forms of oppression in this culture. We are not encouraged to feel our feelings deeply. And not only do we not often have ritual for that, but those feelings are often pathologized. You know, we get the message frequently that if we're really in deep grief, that there's something a little bit wrong about that we should just be more faithful, or we should be more hopeful, or we're just, we're getting too dark about this. So it can, again, be really hard to allow the feeling to have its say and take us to the place that it's wanting to take us, because every one of our feelings has a gift for us. It's here for a purpose. It has a meaning and an energy it's trying to offer us. So grief expressed in safety softens us, And I want to just name grieving as an expression of love. We don't grieve for things we don't care about. We don't feel moved to tears if we're indifferent to something. And so our grief is an expression of how deeply we love something. And so the more we grieve and the more our heart opens, the more deeply we can love, and the more deeply we will grieve when the things we love are either threatened or wounded. So we are going to do a ritual now. So I'm going to ask you just to begin settling into your chair and bringing your attention inward. Let yourself take a couple of breaths. Maybe notice how your belly rises and falls with your breathing. Maybe notice how with the exhale, your body sinks a little more deeply into your chair, gets a little heavier, and feels that support a little bit more. Notice anything in your body, tensions or eases, impulses toward movement. And just allow yourself to notice internally what's your response to what's been said about grief. Take just a minute to breathe into that, and as you notice a feeling, whether that's a sorrow or an outrage or a fear or a gratitude, take a minute to just type that into the chat. We're going to have a little altar with candles that Jan will light, and Carrie will read our sorrows and our gratitudes as the candles are lit. So take a minute and do that when you're ready.
Grateful for the bear who walked through my yard this morning. I feel fear for the state of the planet. I feel gratitude to be here. Outraged that those white supremacists in Congress who aided the insurrection are being let off the hook by their colleagues. I feel sorrow that the increase in extreme events kills the weak and oppressed. My sorrow is that the grief of our existence will be ongoing. Sorrow for the suffering of the world, gratitude for connection and healing. Gratitude for recognition of grief. Gratitude for the warmth of the fire. Sorrow for all of the ways we have degraded this beautiful paradise in human beings we share it with. Sorrow for loss of my family, and grateful for the grounding of my gardens. Gratitude for this circle and each of you being here. Sorrow for the fires in rural Alaska harming Indigenous communities. Grateful for the sense of belonging with those who care like I do. My gratitude for the wind howling to let us know that we are a part of this beautiful planet. Thank you, everyone, for all that you shared.
Thank you for sharing that, and just take your time to see those sorrows and those gratitudes held in light and in sacredness, and just breathe that in.
I want to name another of the sorrows and gratitudes that was listed. Rage at the racial injustice in this country, gratitude for allies, and grateful for a desire to keep trying.
Thank you. And perhaps you can just begin to feel the web of support that we're building as we risk bringing ourselves into this space and sharing with authenticity. So we're now going to have brief introductions to each of the emotions involved with grief. So each of our eco-grief facilitators is going to say a little bit about one of those emotions. So Carrie, will you begin with sorrow, please?
We all know sorrow. It is a fundamental part of the human experience. And we also know the dysfunctional expressions of sorrow. It can become too much to bear. We can get stuck in depression, unable to connect and engage with others, and even lose interest in life when sorrow gets stuck. Sorrow can become intractable sadness that pervades every facet of life. But as painful as it is, there's also a spiritual value to sorrow. Sorrow and the process of grief shows us the depth of our love. Grief strips us bare, it breaks us open, and it has the potential to alchemize our sorrow and lead us on a journey back into love. I saw this many, many times as a chaplain when I accompanied people through the process of grief. Often I heard people say that it had changed over time, and where there had been such profound loss, there was now profound love. There is love in the midst of sorrow. Grief has a way of turning us all into mystics. It breaks us open and distills our hearts to feel the love that was always within us. In The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Francis Weller writes that we must learn the art and craft of grief, discover the profound ways that it deepens and ripens us. And while grief is an intense emotion, it is also a skill that we develop through a profound walk with loss. Facing grief is hard work. It takes profound courage to face outrageous loss, and that this is the spiritual work of our time. Weller writes that sorrow and grief and going through the process of grief connect us back into the soul of the world. The converging crises of our time are symptomatic of separation and alienation from the earth and our fellow beings on the planet. And grief and sorrow serve to reconnect us back into the soul of the world. So attending to our sorrow and apprenticing with grief are the vehicle to connect us back into the soul of the world. And when we're gentle with these feelings, it allows the grace of God to come in and to sanctify our pain and reconnect us back to the heart of the planet. As Oscar Wilde writes, where there is sorrow, there is holy ground. So the pain of our times is sacred and holy.
Thank you, Carrie. Laura is going to say a little bit about anger.
You're muted, Laura.
So when I was watching the Capitol being stormed by armed white supremacist insurrectionists, I was mad as hell. I wanted to grab those people and knock them across the head. So for some people, like me, anger is the easiest emotion to access. Any uncomfortable feeling in me will first show up as anger. On the other hand, many of us have been conditioned not to express anger. Many people of faith, and especially women and BIPOC people, receive both implicit and explicit messaging that anger is wrong. Anger, like all the emotions, though, has a positive purpose. Anger tells us when our boundaries have been violated. Anger alerts us to injustice. Something is off in the world. Something is not right. Our antennae are up for a reason. And if we try to tamp down those feelings of anger, especially if we do that on a regular basis, we can become numb to the realities of injustice or paralyzed from acting on the injustice that we see. So an appropriate use of anger is bringing to light whatever is disruptive to loving and just relationships. Relationships between people, between races, between nations, between people and the planet. Anger is the fuel to take strong action to stand in the way of harm. Anger is a fiery emotion, and like fire, it can keep us warm and alive, and it can burn things to the ground. So being able to acknowledge and process anger as it arises can keep us from accumulating an explosive amount of anger, or from allowing our anger to distill into resentment or cynicism. And part of that processing includes looking underneath the anger to see what's even deeper. Often this is sadness. If we're heartbroken about something, lashing out in anger may feel like taking action, while crying about it may just feel helpless. So if we can begin to pay attention to how these different emotions feel in our body, we might notice that sadness can make us contract and pull inward. And anger, by contrast, is expansive. It feels big. It moves outward. This is why we can be apprehensive about it. But still, this outward, expansive energy is also what can be great about anger. It can move us from grief into action. It can give us courage. It can ignite that fierce mother bear energy that will protect what it loves, no matter what.
Thank you, Laura. Sarah's going to say something about fear.
Good morning, everyone. I want to talk briefly about fear. And first, I'll just name that fear is one of the emotions that I feel closest to in considering the climate and environmental crisis. Like Laura feels so close to anger, I feel very close to fear. And I think that that's probably true for many of us, for many activists and scientists and those of us on this call today, because if you are paying attention to the science and the stories of people who are being adversely impacted by climate change today, then it is difficult not to feel afraid. Last year at this convening, our resident theologian, Emily Askew, named that fear and despair are sane responses to the world that we are living in. As are anger and sorrow, all of these feelings, these are sane responses to the world that we are living in. Those of us who are paying attention know that globally we have yet to respond to the climate crisis with the boldness and collaboration required to prevent mass suffering. And we also know that mass suffering as a result of climate change is already a reality for many. So fear in the wake of this knowledge that we carry is natural. Anxiety is natural. I want to first affirm that for each person here. This is a scary moment, and our fear comes from an honest place. That said, fear can, of course, be debilitating. While our fight or flight response has kept us alive evolutionarily, it does not always serve us as we strive to do this work and live our lives. Sometimes we may feel paralyzed or completely overwhelmed. We may have panic attacks, feel our hearts racing in our chests. We may be unable to rouse ourselves from bed. Or conversely, we may feel completely unable to rest as we strive to outrun our fear through busyness. I have felt these feelings. I know them well. And again, I want to affirm that in feeling these, you are not alone. I also want to invite all of us into thinking about the gifts of fear. Fear is born of wisdom. It comes from an acknowledgement of risk. We cannot lean into bravery or courage unless fear, that acknowledgement of risk, is present. Fear tells us that we are alive, that we are breathing, that we are noticing, that we're paying attention, that we're taking in the risks and registering them. And fear tells us that we are connected to what we love. When we are afraid, it is because we understand loss and we understand that there is much at stake. And so I want to invite us to hold our fear gently and to recognize the wisdom it communicates. I want to invite us to breathe through those moments of panic, if and when they come. We are living human beings. We are awake, and our fear tells us that. Breathing communicates to our brains and our hearts that we are resilient. Lastly, I want to invite us all into the work of courage and bravery that fear creates and makes possible. May we be courageous. May we hold our fear and learn from it. And as the poet Rilke says, I have faith in nights. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Jan is going to speak to us about guilt and shame.
Thank you. So I am speaking today about the concepts of guilt and shame and how they can both influence grief. And I used to get shame and guilt muddled together as one concept. But a distinction that Brene Brown, who is a researcher on this subject, makes is that shame is a focus on self and guilt is a focus on behavior. Shame suggests I am bad, and guilt suggests I did something bad. Shame brings us painful feelings of being flawed and unworthy of love or belonging, of being different, or of not being understood. Shame can erode our courage and cause us to disengage, whereas guilt can cause us into action, to right the wrong we believe we've created. Unfortunately, we live in a world where most people still subscribe to the belief that shame is a good tool for keeping people in line. Not only is this working, but it's dangerous. Shame is highly correlated with addiction, violence, aggression, depression, eating disorders, and bullying. Shame needs secrecy and judgment to flourish. And during our time of this climate crisis, shame is projected onto the poor, the migrant, or those who live in underserved or toxic neighborhoods. The voice of this population must be heard and healed through the work of reconciliation in addressing the climate crisis. Now, we have elders and ancestors who have shown us ways of healing. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Black Elk, Rachel Carson, Jane Goodall, Joanna Macy, and Thomas Berry, to name a few. Both shame and guilt can carry deep pain, consciously or unconsciously, until insight and healing can occur. Our society, our culture today is living with the dynamics of both shame and guilt. And we are seeing strength in people who are voicing their needs and doing the hard work of reconciliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Martha, say a little bit about despair and hopelessness.
Thank you. Any one of the emotions that we encounter along the grief journey can become complicated if unattended and can lead to experiences of further loss. This can result in hopelessness and despair. Despair is defined as the complete loss of absence or absence of hope. In essence, despair can be its own experience of loss. If we believe that loss and grief can be transformative, then where do we experience this with despair? Joanna Macy tells us that we tend to fear that if we consciously acknowledge our despair, we may get mired in it, incapacitated. But despair, like any emotion, is dynamic. Once experienced, it flows through us. It is only our refusal to acknowledge and feel it that keeps it in place. She speaks to the psychological strategies we use to repress and cope with the pain we experience in our suffering with the world, and the fears that hold us captive and inhibit our action. I would ask you to hold in your mind the image of suffering with, and I would make the observation that when we are suffering with, we are not suffering alone. The work of addressing despair and hopelessness is centered in the truth that we are not alone, that in fact, we are interconnected with the world and with one another. That is the very good news. In our interconnectedness, we understand, because we have experienced it ourselves, and we share the same breath, that the soul of the world is a wounded soul that has sustained and continues to sustain great losses. How then do we bring hope to the despair and hopelessness of our grief for a wounded world? Macy's despair work requires first a willingness to acknowledge the pain we experience and how it is shared with each other and the world. It is this empathic response which allows for us to suffer with. Once we acknowledge and accept this pain, we can bring to it the power of compassion and caring and community and love. This is not a power that is wielded over others, but it is a power that is shared and a power that is dynamic. And it is a power that enables us to enter into intentional and active hope. Active hope is about becoming active participants in bringing about what we hope for. May it be so.
May it be so. Thank you. I'm going to say just a little bit about acceptance and integration, and then we're going to go into our small groups to have everybody have a chance to share some about what's come up for you. So I'm so appreciative of the sharings that we've had about these feelings and just the awareness that we need to befriend. We need to understand the divine purpose of each of our emotions and to just name again how challenging that can be when they're so intense and large and ongoing, and when culturally there's not a lot of space and support made. And so I want to name, we're talking about the courage and the vulnerability, the courage of vulnerability to move into those spaces and to share that, and how empowering it is to be in circles with other people who share those feelings. I think often the first time we're able to feel safe enough to go into the depth of one of those places we're not so familiar with is when we're in presence with somebody who knows that feeling, whose body is open to that feeling, who says, yes, you can do this, it will be okay. You'll come through the other side. And so the power of our sharing with each other, the power of being able to speak the truth of what's happening for us into ears that are open and hearts that are open, I think can't be overstated. I also want to say that I think integration happens in waves, just as grief happens in waves, so that we allow our hearts to break open with sorrow, or we allow our hearts to explode open with anger, or to tremble in fear, or to feel the guilt or the shame. And as we move through that, as our heart makes space for that to be held internally in compassion, as that gets befriended and loved in our own system by experiencing that from others and with others, the sacred alchemy happens. The sacred alchemy that creates larger and larger space within our own system to hold love and gratitude and sorrow all together. And as we do that, the space and the power of our presence to hold that compassion and that trust and that awareness of the divine nature, the divine purpose of our grief, can be shared with others in a way that allows this to spread and to create more safety and more clarity and more power in the world for the love of the world to be expressed in the ways it needs to be expressed. So thank you for your courage in being here. And we are now going to break into small groups for, let's say, 12 minutes, Sarah. So I invite you, I'm going to say just a little bit about this. Just allow yourself to notice as you move toward this small group what it feels like to be invited to share. You may notice some fear coming up. You may notice some trepidation from past experiences. Most of us have had the experience somewhere in our lives of being in deep grief. And when we attempted to share that, having the response be to try and fix it or make it better immediately, or kind of pat it on the shoulder and invite it to go away. So because there's so little space and support for grief in our culture, many of us can get anxious when someone else is in deep grief, particularly if we haven't fully owned and befriended our own. So we invite you in these small groups to really focus your attention on listening to each other, on being present for each other with respect and trust of another person's feelings and their process. And I invite you, as you share, to be vulnerable and to be aware of the loving support of the group. So, yes, let's do that, and we'll see you back here for closing in a little bit. Thank you.
Man, I missed it. Oh, I fucked up. Oh, man. What I do?
Me.
You're still here. Look at that dude right there.
Looks like we're all still here. Well,
Look
that's
at
good.
Chad. Look at Chad.
Okay. Well, I hope that felt supportive and gave you just a little bit of space to feel wherever you are in that and have a moment of support and compassion in that. So in closing, I'm just going to call on each of you one at a time to just share a word or sentence that describes sort of what you're taking from this with you. And if we have time, we probably won't. Never mind. I'm just going to go around how I see you on my screen. So Dwayne, are you okay to start?
Yeah, and I'm supposed to say, what is it you said?
Any word or sentence about sort of what you're taking out of this with you?
Practice.
Beautiful. Thank you. Carrie?
Connection.
Marjorie?
Community.
Rita?
Hopeful.
Nice. Chaz?
Grace.
Lovely. Danny?
Inspired.
Thank you. Anna?
I'd say community as well.
Amy?
Support.
Candace? Say it again. Your unmute didn't quite work. Still couldn't hear it. Sorry. You can put it in the chat and I'll read it for you. Susan?
Feelings can be a divine resource.
Nice. Diane?
Curious.
Nice. And Candace's word was togetherness. Thank you. Martha?
Hope.
Sarah?
Gentleness.
Laura?
Motivation.
Liana?
Heard.
Heard? Thank you. Jan?
Feeling of sacred space.
Oh, thank you, everybody. It's just now 12. Are you okay if I read a poem for us to close? We'll be over by 12:01. So this is a poem from John O'Donohue. A prayer for your wild soul. Give yourself time to make a prayer that will become the prayer of your soul. Listen to the voices of longing in your soul. Listen to your hungers. Give attention to the unexpected that lives around the rim of your life. Listen to your memory and the inrush of your future, to the voices of those near you and those you have lost. Out of all that attention to your soul, make a prayer that is big enough for your wild soul, yet tender enough for your shy and awkward vulnerability, that has enough healing to gain the ointment of divine forgiveness for your wounds. Enough truth and vigor to challenge your blindness and complacency. Enough graciousness and vision to mirror your immortal beauty. Write a prayer that is worthy of the destiny to which you have been called. Thank you so much, everybody, for being with us. What a wonderful time. So grateful.
And thank you, Connie.
My pleasure. My deep, deep pleasure.
Thank you.
Good to
Thank
be
you.
with you all. Blessings.
Thank you. Nice to see all of you.
Yes.
And close the room. I didn't know it. I didn't know what to do.
That's okay. Be nice if we could stay on for just a second to check in.
Okay. Good to be with you, Rita and Candace.
Yeah,
Thank you. I enjoyed it too. It's great.
good.
Much. I'm copying the resources in the chat and then I'll get off.
Go
Great.
for it.
Go
That's
for it.
great.
Yes. Love that.
Thank you for being with us.
Woohoo!
Woohoo.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you, everybody.